Much like the narrator, I return to you all again to lead you through the woods of the deep and meaningful game, Slay the Princess. In my last video, I fleshed out the lore and characters, but we didn't even scratch the surface of this game. I'm also going to be going into this video fully assuming that you've seen the first one, so if you haven't, I definitely recommend doing so, or you might get lost. This also serves as your spoiler warning for the whole game and a potential graphic imagery warning, though it wasn't too bad last time. As long as I keep using the footage where the shifting mount is pulling a weekend at Bernie's with the damsel princess, it should be pretty good. So today we're going to be taking a look at some of the biggest mysteries left over from the game, diving into the meaning behind all the endings, and uncovering a huge hidden aspect of this game that made me wonder if making this video in the first place was a mistake. So grab your shifting mount and practice the long quiet while I spin you a tale today. I regret everything. After my first video, I actually had the immense pleasure of getting to talk to Slay the Princess creators Toby Howard-Arias and Abby Howard, as well as composer Brandon Boone, and ask them some of my most burning questions. And while many understandably had to go unanswered, since the player's individual interpretations and the conversation around that are important to them, they were able to shed some light on aspects that I think are really cool. But let me be clear up front, the majority of the things I'm covering in this video are my personal interpretations. I'll specify if something was said by one of them, but the last thing I want to do is put words in their mouths. So for example, one of the things I had to ask was, yo, how did the narrator as a mortal split the cycle of life and death into two gods? And they felt that providing any answer to that would only limit the story they were trying to tell. So the most that I can offer is possible scenarios that are impossible to verify on purpose. But I know that for me, my mind rests a little easier if I can have a fun pretend backstory in my head. So here's what I can offer to those who feel the same way. There are three main routes I think this could take: the scientific route, a magical route, or an ideological or spiritual route. If the game is meant to take place somewhere or sometime within our universe, the approach of the end of days means it likely takes place in the far, far future. After all, the narrator specifies that the bones of the universe are old. If it takes place this far into the future, science could have advanced to the point where they were on the brink of something like this being possible. Maybe the narrator was a brilliant scientist or doctor that decided to devote his life to finding a cure for death, secretly researching and testing until finally discovering a way to split an intangible concept. But maybe this game is meant to be set in a completely different world, one in which magic exists. After all, the narrator is a corvid creature that can talk. Who knows what the world he came from is like? Perhaps he was a wizard, and in his world magic was able to be learned and practiced freely as long as one didn't venture into forbidden magic that tampered with forces beyond their control. And in an act of desperation, he broke that rule. Finally, as I discussed in the last video, one meaning of the construct lies entirely in the world of the intangible, dealing in ideas only. Be it through religious, spiritual, or philosophical means, maybe the narrator was an enlightened individual who was able to connect with a higher force through meditation, altering the order of the world purely through thought. It may seem odd, but it's an abstract explanation for an abstract situation. Again, these are all just fun word pictures I'm painting you. Nothing here is written in stone, and according to Tony, there are no current plans to expand on that aspect of the story in the near future, so it's truly just speculation. Speaking of the narrator though, Abby, who was also the illustrator for the game, did verify that the protagonist and the narrator do in fact differ in design, and that she has a complete design of the protagonist that she didn't reveal in the game. But is it better than this amorphous swamp thing I made for the last thumbnail, Abby? Yes, almost certainly yes. And while it did point out the fact that the protagonist had additional owl-like features that the narrator seemed to lack, my mind was left buzzing with why all of the protagonist's inner thoughts would share the same voice as the narrator if the narrator didn't create the protagonist in his image. And then something hit me. We already know that the protagonist's thoughts and actions shape the world, the princess, and his inner voices, and that he can be influenced by outside perspectives as we covered in the last video. And whose voice is the very first one that he hears upon coming to in the woods? The narrator's. It isn't until the next screen that we hear the very first inner voice, the voice of the hero, which is shaped by what the protagonist knows. The only thing he knows so far, the narrator's voice. So I believe that the narrator and the voices all share the same voice because they were shaped by the protagonist coming into consciousness in this form and having nothing to base the voice of his inner voices on but the narrator. Now you might be thinking, coming into consciousness in this form is a super specific way to phrase that, Anna. How do we know what happened prior to where we start the game? That's a great question, one I wondered myself. What happened the moment before the narrator says you're on a path in the woods? What was before the Chapter 1 title card? One who is playing the game for the first time might assume that we were already walking through the woods for one reason or another, like opening a storybook somewhere in the middle and reading from there. While someone who's finished the game might think that it's possible that this isn't the protagonist's first time going through the loop, since one of the endings offers the ability to do it all again, and when she kills us we instantly go back to the woods. But there's a piece of the puzzle here that's missing, one that's skipped over for effectiveness and time's sake if you choose the loop loop ending, and that's Oblivion. You can experience Oblivion twice, actually. The first way is if, after the first chapter, you refuse to go to the cabin 5 different times. Each time results in an incomplete shifting mound going through a different stage of grief, until finally she reshapes you into something formless and you enter Oblivion. Oblivion being defined as a state marked by lack of awareness or consciousness, like the oblivion of sleep. But the other time you experience Oblivion is before chapter 1, and in between ultimate loops of the entire construct. We know this because the first time you meet the shifting mound in the Long Quiet, she says she has only just now stirred to consciousness. And in the loop ending, the princess says, "Make me send us back to the beginning, before we woke up." This alone cues us into the fact that before the first chapter, they were in a state of slumber. But there's one more smoking gun, and that's the official soundtrack. The first song you hear when you start a new game is a song titled The Princess, and the princess also plays in the main menu. And yet the very first song on the soundtrack is Oblivion, and that's no coincidence. It's because Oblivion comes before the event of waking up in the woods. You and the princess were unconscious. And take a listen to the track itself. You can hear the shifting mound breathing, either in a slumber or continuously waking up. Speaking of the music, I'm gonna go all share and say, can we get a little commotion for the music? Because it plays such a pivotal role in not only supporting the game's story, but swaying the player's emotions. As previously mentioned, in the woods you hear the iconic princess motif. Brandon said that he wanted it to portray innocence, but have an element of something being off, alternating major and minor chords and looping endlessly, echoing the gameplay. But the track also mirrors the gameplay in that the song changes just like the surroundings do based on what route and chapter you're on. You can hear how the song gets more regal in the damsel route, or creepier in the nightmare route. Further abstracting the deeper you go, like in the moment of clarity, which branches off of the nightmare route. This building of the atmosphere can also be heard in the Long Quiet whenever you present a vessel to the shifting mound. You can hear how the music shifts from instrumentals to vocals as she grows and gains sentience, finally resulting in a beautiful symphony of orchestration and vocals. Of course, things are elevated to a whole new level during your confrontation with the fully realized shifting mound, which Brandon said he wanted to feel awe-inspiring, like facing off against a Final Fantasy boss. And honestly, I get it. When I asked Brandon where else he drew inspiration from for the game's music, some of the ones he listed were the Little Nightmares soundtrack for the Nightmare, Florence and the Machine for the Grey Water, the band Health for the Fury, Attack on Titan for the Apotheosis, and so there were other musical nods to composers he really admired that he hadn't yet seen anyone recognize. Sound off in the comments if there were any musical moments where you were like, ooh, that reminds me of this other thing. As promised in the last video, now it's time to talk about the Extra Shackle. In the Chapter 1 cabin, and in most of the other cabins as well, there's an extra unused chain next to the one the princess is shackled by. In the prisoner route, the protagonist can inspect the shackle, and if he does, it will jump with a magnetic force from his grasp to close around his neck, showing that the shackle is clearly meant for us. But the chain actually only has a shackle attached in the prisoner route. This could possibly be because if there was an open shackle in the others, the player might assume that the princess had already gotten one arm out of the shackle, which would change one's perspective on the situation. Or perhaps none of the others have a shackle because the protagonist was already gifted the freedom of choice, while the princess is fated to be on the receiving end of that choice. And in the prisoner route, you're confronted with her lack of freedom more directly, and might be more empathetic towards her plight, even possibly consciously or subconsciously choosing to physically join her. And since the cabin is shaped by your subconsciousness, it serves as a reminder that, as Abby points out, though the princess may be physically chained to this place, you're not any more free than her. But what about the friggin' mirrors in the cabins? Why do they disappear? Why can't the narrator see them? This is another thing that the creators were reluctant to comment on, so it's up to Detective Hannah. Let's start with what the mirror represents. I believe it to represent the truth about death and about who and what you are, and as such is also a gateway to the Long Quiet, which I theorized in the last video also symbolizes a space between lifetimes. Let's look at the evidence for this. Every time the mirror shows up when you've completed a path and thus your purpose of obtaining a vessel for the shifting mound has come to an end. The voices are terrified of the mirror because they believe it to mean the death of themselves. We know later that they remain in the folds of the construct and return in future runs, and once we arrive at the mirror again and our memory returns, we have dialogue options we can say to the voices that include, "It's not the end, whatever's on the other side is going to be nice. It's the end for you, but not for me, and I'll see you on the other side. It's going to be okay." This reflects one of the game's central themes that death is not the end, but merely a transition into something new. It's that same concept we see throughout of, yes, you will die, kind of, but it's not as simple as that. And there's exactly one route where all of the voices are in your head when you come to the mirror, but they're not afraid of their death, and that's the moment of clarity. We'll come back to the moment of clarity, but to keep pulling on this thread, once you look in the mirror and see yourself, that's when you enter the long quiet. After talking to the shifting mound, you must return to obtain another vessel for her, and she lets you know that in doing so, you will lose all of your previous memories until you return. Once you say, okay, make me forget, you hear the sound of breaking glass, like a mirror being shattered, and you're back in the woods a blank slate again. But why can't the narrator see the mirrors in the cabins, and why do they disappear when we try to interact with them? This is where it gets a little complicated, but either way, I believe the mirrors are actually placed in the cabin by your deep subconscious, not meant to actually be observed by the narrator or interacted with by you, but as a way to keep the protagonist on the track to self-discovery. Almost the antithesis of the narrator, whose job it is to steer you towards killing the princess, the mirror's job is to steer you towards the truth. And you shape the construct. However, the princess's words and actions also shape your thoughts and in turn the world, so she also has a hand in all of this and would have reason to guide you towards self-discovery. But regardless, you two are entwined, so it's a bit pointless to assign just one of you to influencing your subconscious's creation of the mirrors. The point is that what you believe to be true in the construct is true. So if your deep subconscious made the mirrors so that the narrator wouldn't be able to see them, he can't see them. But it's almost one step further. They were created to not tangibly exist. Obviously, when you try to touch the mirror, it disappears, but it also disappears in the last few frames if you just leave. The mirror isn't actually a part of the cabin, and you're not meant to be able to look into it because you're not ready for it. But as you get closer to being ready, the mirror presents itself more obviously. In Chapter 2, the mirror always shows up on the side of the cabin, just a subtle reminder. But in Chapter 3, it's always in the middle, right in your path, forcing you to confront it if you want to progress. And surprise, surprise, in the moment of clarity route, at first, all you see is the mirror where the cabin should be and nothing else. There's a reason this is called the moment of clarity, but to get into that, we must talk about, by and large, the biggest piece of this game's puzzle. I'm so excited. Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Hey, I don't know if you could tell, but this game's about death. But more than that, this game's about meaning. Meaning is spoken of a lot, and in the strange ending, if you choose to take the knife when you go down to talk to the princess, it locks you into certain choices. If you're like, I take it back, I don't want to kill you, I just want to go back to being a god, she spells it out, saying there's no turning back now. You came down here with a knife, which means the knife has to get used, or there wouldn't have been any meaning to taking it. And this place is all about meaning. Chekhov's pristine blade. Now, when talking about the meaning of life and death, religion and philosophy are bound to slip into the conversation, since these topics inherently examine those exact concepts. Already looking for these references, Tony and I talked a bit about his degree in psychology and how he took courses in philosophy and contemplative studies, which he described as a synthesis of Eastern religion / meditative practices and neuroscience. But he admitted that that might have had more of a subconscious influence than an overt one. But Tony, I'm diving headfirst into that pool because I think those subconscious influences are juicy. I also think maybe Tony was being a bit humble here, because I have a hard time believing that the following concepts accidentally match up as well as they do, so let's give him the credit either way. So let's talk religion and philosophy. The game itself mentions nihilism, which is the philosophical belief that, in layman's terms, life has no meaning or point to it, and in such there is no reason to uphold moral principles. Although the narrator at times questions if the protagonist is a nihilist, the only one who actually seems to hold that philosophy in this game is the voice of the cold, who frequently comments on how nothing matters. What we see more than anything are references to Eastern religions and philosophies. For example, both Hinduism and Buddhism believe in reincarnation, and although the specifics of the concept differ between the two, the cycle of death and rebirth into a new form is consistent. Visually, the shifting mound also bears resemblance to many Buddhas and Hindu gods and deities with multiple heads and arms, which are often intended to convey, among other things, omnipotence, an all-knowing nature, and a multitudinous nature, as in containing multitudes. The seemingly endless number of arms the shifting mound has is reminiscent of the thousand-armed manifestation of the Bodhisattva Guanyin, whose many arms were made to allow her to reach out to all of those in need. However, far more than Buddhism or Hinduism, we can see massive ties to Daoism in this game, which isn't necessarily exclusive from the other, since Eastern religion and philosophy practitioners often observe several different religions and philosophies. It's not as cut and dry as Western religion tends to be. Also, you may have seen Daoism spelled with a T before, and this is just a case of two different English spellings of the same concept that differ due to translation methods. But it's all the same. Tomato Daoism. And when I explain this, you're gonna go, oh. So Daoism can be characterized as both a religion and a philosophy. Like I said, it's not as cut and dry as in the West. And the amorphous nature of Daoism doesn't stop there. Daoism is a tradition that encourages one to follow and live in harmony with the Tao, commonly translated as the Way. In fact, there are two texts that are generally accepted as the foundations of Daoism, the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. And the Tao Te Ching's opening line approximately translates to, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao." This insinuates that it is impossible to truly define Tao. If you think you can define it, you have it wrong. Something that is beyond definition. Sounds familiar. Despite not having a true definition, I'm gonna give it my best shot, and please keep in mind that I'm not a scholar on this or anything. Tao is sort of like an ultimate driving force behind everything in the cosmos. It created the universe and flows throughout it, a natural energy that keeps everything transforming and balanced. While that is one way to describe the Tao, you can also use this as a directive for how to follow the Tao, or the Way. As in, the Way can describe the metaphorical path you walk, or it can describe the way of the universe. YouTuber George Thompson has a great video where his Taoist Tai Chi master breaks down the Chinese character for Tao, so I'll let Master Gu explain.
The first three strokes, that's Yin Yang and Yang Yang, that represents the Yin Yang balance. Then, Zi, which means oneself. That means Tao is not far from you. Tao is within you. The last part is 走之, which means to go, to move, to act.
So the concept is that though Tao already exists inside of you, you can follow the flow of the universal Tao and live in harmony with it. Now that clip also utilized the Yin Yang, which I'll be pronouncing the standard English way. And that's because the Yin Yang is the most central and important motif in Taoism. It represents the ever-transforming push and pull of opposites that allows everything to flow. Although theories regarding the creation of the universe differ among Taoist beliefs, there's a quote in the Tao Te Ching that reads, "The Tao produced one, one produced two, two produced three, three produced all things." A common Taoist theory is that the beginning of the universe was primordial chaos, and from this sprang the Tao. The Tao created Taiji, or the Supreme Ultimate as it's often translated, which would be the one in the quote, and the one producing two refers to the Taiji dividing into two forces, yin and yang. Although the term dividing here is more for the sake of visualization, since it's like two sides of the same coin, and forces makes yin and yang sound like purely nouns, when they can actually also be descriptors. Anyway, the two dividing into three is commonly thought to refer to the interaction between the yin and yang, creating three kinds of qi, which then combines and interacts to create everything and everyone, the all. There are two big takeaways from the yin yang. First, the words yin and yang themselves describe the shady and sunny side of a hill. The concept being that as the sun rises and sets, the sunny and shady sides of the hill are constantly changing and transforming and cycling back around. And the same is true for everything. Everything is in a constant state of transformation. The other big takeaway lies in the fact that it is not a perfect divide down the center, and that each segment is balanced with a portion of the opposite within it. This shows that the opposites of the world are not only complementary, but reliant on each other. That there cannot be one without the other, for they are one and the same. The yin-yang dictates that there cannot be light without dark, hot without cold, strength without weakness, good without bad, and on and on and on. Now I'm sure at this point you've picked up on the parallels between this and the shifting mound and long quiet. One turning into two, and those two being in a constant and everlasting dance with one another. The narrator even says that when he broke the cycle, he made sure that the tear was rough, that you carry a part of what should be her, and she carries a part of what should be you. It's right there! The complementary nature of the two can be heard in the music as well. Brandon pointed out that the Long Quiet track compiled 8 different vocal samples from Jonathan Sims, the voice actor for the narrator and voices, and modulated and distorted them into a wall of sound that both complemented and contrasted the vocals in the shifting mound tracks. A little yin to the yang. Now, yin and yang both have descriptors that commonly go with each side. And while visually it seems obvious which god is meant to represent yin and which is supposed to represent yang, it's not that straightforward. They actually each have qualities from both sides. The qualities and descriptors associated with yin, the black side, include night, cold, soft, dark, female, yielding, flexible, and passive, among other things. Whereas yang, the white side, has descriptors like day, hot, hard, bright, male, resistant, steady, and action. Both share several of these qualities. The protagonist is the one who takes action and makes choices, while the shifting mound passively receives the vessels he chooses to bring her. But the shifting mound is ultimately the one taking action and pushing you forward, even saying that you're ever the passive player, but it's in your nature. And this makes sense, since due to the nature of yin and and yang, one always contains the other, and one can even turn into the other. But while yin and yang have descriptors associated with them, you'll also remember that I said they were descriptors themselves. There's a video on TED's channel by John Bellamy that lists off so many examples that will blow your mind, but my favorite example from the video is that the inside space of a cup is yin, while the cup itself is yang. It wouldn't be a cup without both aspects. And yin being the space within the cup reminds me a lot of the concept of the long quiet, almost of nothingness. So honestly, which god lines up with which side is completely inconsequential, because they're interchangeable and transformative in nature. The Shifting Mound even says, does it matter where one thing ends and the other begins? That's the concept of yin yang, baby. Tao is both everything and nothing, which is what they were when they were one. Really puts the chapter title, The Moment of Clarity, into perspective, huh? When you view things from the lens that the two gods originated from Tao, everything that the Shifting Mound says begins to line up. Tao is not a being or god, just a power that creates and transforms simply because that's what's in its nature. And just like in the game, this process of transformation includes death, but death is simply a changing over into something new. And the idea that universal forces would care about humans over any other thing is just a product of natural human self-centeredness. It's why she insists that only bodies fear death, that humans are too small to be considered, and that their suffering is born of their own delusion. She's not being mean, she's being as indifferent as the universe is under Daoism. It's not about you, Jessica. She believes that the good cannot exist without the bad, and that life has no meaning without death, which reflects the Yin Yang philosophy that one side cannot exist without the other. And she refuses to request specific vessels, instead opting to receive what you send her way with gratitude, which echoes the Taoist belief that one should follow the flow of the Tao instead of resisting or trying to shape it. Just to really drive home the parallels, I'd like to read this quote from the Taoist text, the Book of Liezi. If nothing within you stays rigid, outward things will disclose themselves. Moving, be like water. Still, be like a mirror. Respond like an echo. So now that we've drawn that comparison, let's take a look at the possible meaning of the endings, because I don't buy that all endings are created equal. And let me stress again that my interpretations and opinions on these are completely my own, not the creators, who in fact specified that they wanted to avoid players basically attempting to min-max and save scum in order to get the quote-unquote best world state, since the existence of a best world state makes choice superfluous and tends to lead to pragmatic decisions in place of the intended emotional ones. And I respect the crap out of this, but it doesn't stop me from having strong opinions, which I will voice now. Tier list! Let's start with the good ending, which is where you kill the princess, then learn that the narrator has detached you from the world indefinitely, and you spend eternity in the cabin. Not only do you have to try to keep yourself entertained in a tiny cabin with a dead person downstairs and only a voice or two to keep you company, but you'd always be wondering what happened to the world, never able to see the ones you affected yourself. Sure, the narrator tells you that you're blissful, but he also tells you that time loses all meaning and everything blurs together. And most of the time you end up offing yourself. You can choose to stay down there forever, at which point it fades to the credits, but I would argue that unless you're a psychopath, you likely just started a new game and chose a different path, since in reality you wouldn't actually be blissful looking at one room for eternity. It should be no surprise that this one goes in the F tier. Now let's move on to the new and unending Dawn ending, where you choose to kill the princess and live your life as a god. This is so bad. I have so many problems with this. Let's start with the mental toll this would take on the protagonist. He's fated to live without his other half for eternity, completely alone. Sure, he has his inner voices, but yeah, that sounds healthy, your only company being the voices in your head. But hey, one could say that they probably made this choice not for the protagonist's sake, but for the world's sake, for the people's sake. But I truly fail to see this as a good choice for them either. Some people are like, you got rid of death! Everyone gets to live forever! Cool! And to that I'm like, oh, you sweet summer child. You beautiful, beautiful creature who's never experienced depression. Like the Shifting Mound says at one point, that feels more like a curse than anything. There are days where whatever number of years I've got left feels like a lot to handle. Which may be dark, but I guarantee there are a lot of people who relate to that, and the concept of eternal life is unthinkable to them. But honestly, I think it's a scope that can't be fully conceptualized by anyone. No one has experienced eternity, or anything even remotely close to it. The 100 years or so that we get, and that's being generous, compared to eternity is nothing. Much like you're unable to accurately visualize what a group of 300 billion people would look like, you cannot empathize with the scope of eternity. It's impossible. But you know who has tasted it? The protagonist. Remember the good ending? Where the narrator gave you everlasting bliss for eternity? And remember when you offed yourself because you were bored and unhappy? And the narrator is blown away by this because he was sure eternal bliss would make you happy. But he was wrong. So what's to say he's not wrong about a world without death being better? And the shifting mountain did not just contain death. So this is an eternity on a world with how many other things missing too? For example, the narrator guesses that a world without the shifting mountain would be bright, which is a characteristic typically associated with Yang. So hypothetically, let's say that the world is left with the majority of Yang traits. Some of the other Yin traits we might also lose are softness, flexibility, passivity, nighttime. Regardless of if the long quiet contains a small part of her, I'm not sure how you're gonna have a peaceful world without ample amounts of those qualities and others. You can't have Yin without Yang, you can't have Yang without Yin. The world functions because they both exist. That's the whole point. Let's zoom in on the narrator's statements about what an existence without death would look like though. Because he not only says that you carry a part of what should be her, but that things won't be as they are now, but they won't be nothing either. And that it would be an eternal pattern of forgetfulness leading into the joys of rediscovery. Hey, let's dissect that. Okay, so you carry a part of her, and things won't be as they are now, but they won't be nothing either. I don't know whether I pronounce it either or either. I flip-flop. Yin and Yang, baby. Tomato Daoism. This seems to imply that some amount of change is still possible. But how much? Is it like your hair still grows, or is it one can still give birth? If it's the first, your body still functioning means it would still age, and if you live for eternity, that starts to get real macabre real quick. If it's the latter, you may be able to see the issue with people still being born but nobody ever dying. So really, in order to avoid these types of problems, we would need to rely heavily on the other part of what he says, that it would be an eternal pattern of forgetfulness leading into the joys of rediscovery, which to me reads as the world functioning a bit like the construct and being able to reset after a certain amount of time, which dodges the issue of aging but presents a whole new set of problems. How long is your Groundhog Day before you reset? A week? A year? 10 years? Now let's go back to that baby thing. What happens if you want to get pregnant or have a kid during that time? Does your 5-year-old get Thanos when things reset? That seems not good, but like, you could make an argument for like, oh, but you forget, so you have the joy of having a child again. Is that a good life? I don't know. What about people who are in horrendous situations outside of their control when this loop begins? Or someone who's incredibly ill. They have to reset through misery forever. I also shudder to think of what a horrific accident like falling from a 12-story building would entail for someone who can't die. Getting rid of death does not solve everyone's problems. This ending gets a C. But you know what's worse than the new and unending dawn ending? The new and unending dawn and everybody hates you ending. That's right, you get an alteration of the ending if every time you reach the mirror you tell the voices that they're going to die, and you slay the princess as soon as you can at the end. This one's worse because now the only semblance you had of company hates you. And while a lot can change over the course of eternity, the implications of the voice of the opportunist saying, "Knives out, boys, it's time to get to work," is pretty spooky. It gets a D. Also getting a D is the Oblivion ending. Although there's the upside of getting to join together with the shifting mountain again, you can't ever go back to truly being one with her after the narrator tore you in two. So it's just a pale imitation where you're basically just trying to sleep your way through the problem. Plus, you're actively causing pain to the one you love. She wants to grow and learn and is reliant on you to make this happen. She pleads with you to help her when you're constantly leaving the cabin and sadly must just accept her fate at the end. You monster. Another ending is the "You're on a path in the woods" ending, where you agree to reset the construct and start the process all over again. One pro for this is that theoretically it might be okay for the people of the world since you shape reality in the construct. If you ask if resetting would do anything for the people out there, the stranger princess will say, "If you believe we can give them more time, then we can give them more time. It's all up to you." And if you didn't take the knife on the first run, the princess you encounter in the cabin says, "If you believe this helps them, then it will help them, right?" Another pro is at least you'll be given another chance to pick a better ending. Kidding. Kind of. But ultimately, looping forever is still forever. You can actually get the closest to experiencing this by playing the game over and over and over. The game even nods at this by bringing you back to chapter 1. And hey, playing through the game again is great. I did it about 72 times. But that's not forever. And eventually, you probably wouldn't want to play the game anymore. So this ending gets a B. The leave the cabin with the princess or stranger princess ending is the most vague of them all, and that's by design. The princess asks many of the same questions you might. What would even happen? Would we exist inside ourselves? What would that mean? But the entire point of the ending is that you both don't know what would happen, and that thought excites you both. And it's very romantic. You've got the hand holding, you've got the soft sweet music. Even the achievement title of "And What Happens Next?" evokes images of an excited storybook listener leaning forward in anticipation. And after all, one of the first things you read in the game is that this is a love story. You're meant to be with the princess. She's your other half. And fans of the New Dawn ending might say, it could be a love story between you and humanity. And to that I say, sure. That is a valid interpretation. No, I still don't think it's a very loving thing to do. What? Huh? Right, so the leave the cabin ending is purposefully mysterious, but really the way you break out of the construct is by ascending to godhood, right? And in the leave the cabin ending, you're choosing to leave godhood behind. So it seems to follow that you'd still be in the construct, and therefore what's outside the cabin would still be whatever your thoughts shaped it to be. Which could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending. Honestly, I don't know if it makes things more or less complicated to leave with the stranger princess, who's still split into all the different personalities. Although, I will say that her responses to things just feel more fruitful than the regular princesses. Like, she seems to have more to say and a deeper complexity to her. But ultimately, I'm not gonna separate the two into different tiers just because I don't feel like there's enough of a difference to justify it. So they're both going in the A tier. But Anna, why not S? Because the world needs you as gods, gosh darn it. And that's why, for me, leaving with the shifting mound as gods is the best ending. For me. I like the shifting mound, think that the cycle of the universe is more important than the fear of death. What can I say? I'm a big picture gal. I truly think that you two are supposed to represent the yin yang, and in such, both of you are necessary to balance each other out and create order and life and transformation in the universe, as you are each other's other halves. I think there's something about ascending into godhood that rubs people the wrong way, but I don't know, bringing a new universe to life by working together with your equal does not sound bad to me. And compare these ending images. Beautiful growing blades of grass and this. Also, if you're like me, you might have also first thought that this was the world on fire and been like, wow, love what you've done with the place. But Tony was kind enough to inform me that it was supposed to be a red giant, with Abby adding that one struggle she faced while illustrating the game was not being able to show the people and civilization of the outside world, since they couldn't give too much of that away. But red giants, if you don't know, are stars that are in the final stages of their evolution, a dying star, if you will. Fun fact, in about 5 billion years, our sun will become a red giant, swallowing multiple planets. And according to Life and Death of a Planetary System by Elizabeth Landau, Earth probably won't make it out intact. But even if it does, our atmosphere and surface will be bathed in intense radiation, making it uninhabitable. Fun! Maybe that's what the narrator's planet is going through. But seriously though, can we just get a quick vibe check on the two opposite endings? And you're gonna tell me that one of these isn't better than the other? S tier. But guess what? After all of that, I'm in the wrong, and Daoism would agree. The Zhuangzi frequently pushes back on anyone assuming that their truth is the correct truth. Certainty is the result of the ego. By looking for the right truth, one separates my ideas and your ideas, me and you, this and that, which is actively working against the Tao. And between you and me, I'll be the first to admit that I have a huge issue with feeling the constant need to prove that what I'm saying is right. It's a learned defensiveness that I believe stems from being in a predominantly male industry for years, always feeling the need to justify my space in it. And I'm working on it, truly. But the fact that Daoism is like, it's not about concrete answers, and the creators are like, it's not about concrete answers, makes this video feel really hypocritical to me. However, there are two sides to the coin. I was actually really thrilled to learn more about Daoism in this process, and it opened my mind to a lot of new perspectives. So I think there's a value in passing that knowledge along to other people. I also think one of the main objectives of creating this game was to encourage discussion, and this is my contribution to that discussion. But my opinions and perspectives are not right. They're just mine. And this world isn't black and white, it's infinite shades of gray. So I'll end this by quoting my most treasured mantra and one of my personal favorite philosophers. The more I see, the less I know. Michael Frontian Spearhead. I hope you enjoyed this lengthy discussion. I really didn't plan for it to be a two-parter, but you know, sometimes you just gotta do things because you're passionate about them, you know? I also want to give another huge thanks to Tony, Abby, and Brandon for taking the time to chat with me. I just love analyzing games like this, and I've been thinking of changing my channel's description to asking both ridiculously profound and profoundly ridiculous questions about video games. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. below, along with your take on Slay the Princess and which ending your favorite was. I'm gonna be one with the Dao and transform on out of here now. Bye!
Gambana is the wonder why she didn't come to play. Gaming vids that'll make you laugh and think and put them on replay. Intelligent, kind of funny, her community's #1. Stick around and kick your feet up. Gambana has just begun.